We're just two buddies discussing fantasy. Oh God, it's Sorta Sorcery.
I don't know.
Welcome, ladies, gentlemen, cats on the keyboard. You're tuned in to Sorta Sorcery, a grubby, bubbly goo of heroic fantasy stew. My name is Will,
And I'm Chase.
and we're happy to have you here
Oh, yeah.
for the inaugural episode.
It's a special time. We're all very happy. And today we're talking about sword.
Sword
and
and sorcery.
Oh, yeah. We set
Right
that up
on.
very well.
Perfect chemistry.
Beautiful.
You can
Beautiful.
expect a lot more of that to come in your future.
It only gets worse from here.
Oh, yeah. For the uninitiated, the biggest question, of course, is what is sword and sorcery?
Yeah. You ask your average guy in the street, they're going to tell you, it's your guy. Yeah, he's the big barbarian. He's burly, he's strong. He's holding a sword up
Love
to the
him.
sky. Lady right next to him, wearing, well, not much.
Not
to be
much,
fully honest.
no.
She's not wearing much. And it's just, your general, very hyper-masculine, hyper-violent world of barbarism, swords, sorcery. You get what you get.
Yeah, I mean, there are swords most often.
Sure.
And usually sorcery if you're lucky.
If you're lucky, yeah.
And that's a genre. I think what we want to talk about is, one, conceptions people have. Obviously, like Chase is saying, a little bit of misogyny, maybe a little bit of cultural insensitivity at times.
Sure.
But it's an
They're
important
not
genre.
wrong about that.
No.
Yeah.
And starting, I'm just going to read, as any educated man does, straight from Wikipedia.
Beautiful.
And enlighten people a little bit further. And according to the good people at Wikipedia, sword and sorcery is a subgenre of fantasy characterized by sword-wielding heroes engaged in exciting and violent adventures. Elements of romance, magic, and the supernatural are also often present. Unlike works of high fantasy, the tales, though dramatic, focus on personal battles rather than world-endangering matters.
Ooh.
Overlaps commonly with heroic fantasy, wouldn't you guess?
Yes, it does. And one of the greatest works of heroic fantasy, I would say, in the past, I guess 100 years, 19.
Yeah, let's go back as far as we can.
Let's go back as far as we can. in the past million years of human progress. I would say, Conan the Barbarian is generally what people will think when they think of sword and sorcery. There's swords, there's sorcery,
Oh,
there's big burly men.
Oh,
It's the prototypical sword and sorcery.
Big men, little loincloths.
story.
You gotta love it.
It's funny, the ratio of big man to loincloth. The bigger man you get, the smaller the loincloth will be, and that's really what you want. Yeah, basically Conan the Barbarian, or Conan of Samaria. It's the story of a lone barbarian, Conan, as he traverses the world during this age called the Hyperborean Age, which is basically, for the uninitiated, the age of the world after the fall of Atlantis. We all remember.
Yeah.
we remember when Atlantis.
This is
fell.
basic history.
This is basic history. And, he's climbing up the social ladder from thief to king. And this story, basically, when you watch, most sword and sorcery films, most sword and sorcery media, you'll see this barbarian protagonist. And you always wonder, why? Why is this the go-to? Conan is the go-to. Conan is the reason why this is such a common trope. But when you read the original stories, you'll see that the trope was being used to contrast civilized society. Essentially, you'd see the barbarian as this opposite figure to, your kings, to all of these other civilized forces. But what Robert E. Howard, the writer of Conan, wanted to show was that there will always be this element of violence to any kind of large-scale civilized structure. This violence does not only exist among the barbarians, this violence exists among every social structure which we take as common.
Yeah, which is very timely for when he's writing. Obviously, 1950s, post-war period. A lot of bad things had happened in the world. We had seen a pretty ugly side of civilization, a pretty ugly side of institutionalized power, and a lot of this writing, is in response to that.
Yeah.
While fantasy, as I'm sure we'll get into as the podcast goes on, is old as humanity itself, this genre does play a very specific cultural level role in addressing ills that are happening at the time and giving people, in many cases, an escape from what's happening. But yeah, like you're talking about, Robert E. Howard, he's the godfather of sword and sorcery as a subgenre of fantasy. And obviously a lot of people in the time when he was writing were playing on what Robert E. Howard was doing.
Right.
Very popular
Copying.
genre.
Yeah.
They were taking inspiration,
Sure.
very liberal inspiration. But who doesn't get inspired every now and then?
I get inspired constantly.
All the time. And we have a lot of fans at the time who are sort of congregating going into the 60s. There's one particular fanzine, and might I just say, the death of the fanzine is truly one of the greatest losses
Horrible. Yeah.
of comic book, nerd, fantasy, fandom.
Uh-huh.
You know, bring back the fanzine.
Bring it back. You know, what you get now, it'll be some weird, evangelical pastor handing you a pamphlet,
Mhm.
has Sonic the Hedgehog on the front reading the Bible. That's as close as you get to a fanzine now, you know.
Yeah.
It's these brochures.
And it's almost as good.
It's almost as good. If I'm really being honest, when I'm really pitching it to myself, sounds pretty good.
Yeah. And AMRA, 1960s, is the first sword and sorcery specific fanzine.
Mhm.
Now, the first issue doesn't start that way because there's a discussion amongst a lot of other prominent writers of this kind of heroic fantasy.
Mhm.
You have Fritz Lieber, Mike Moorcock, others as well, L. Sprague, and they were talking about what do we call this genre that's new, it's emerging from fantasy, it has some specific tropes.
Right.
And Mike Moorcock is the one who initially poses the question, how do we term this? How do we talk about this? And he writes an open letter to authors, to fans, calling for a name for the genre. And that response comes from Fritz Lieber in the 1961 July issue of AMRA. And he writes, I'm just going to read straight off. He says it so much better than I could.
He's an eloquent man.
Oh,
Ed
yeah.
Moorcock.
And I quote, I feel more certain than ever that this field should be called the sword and sorcery story. This accurately describes the points of culture level and supernatural element, and also immediately distinguishes it from the Cloak and Sword historical adventure story, quite incidentally from the Cloak and Dagger international espionage story too.
James Bond.
James Bond.
James Bond.
And obviously, all these genres, they're interconnected to some extent. While we can say, well, this is sword and sorcery, this is its birth, its inception, those tropes are in other places, they're borrowed. And sword and sorcery itself is just a progression from this age-old history of storytelling and mythology and magic and monsters and guys with big swords.
And then you really get into the question of what is sword and sorcery. Is it a writing style? Is it a checklist of things? Just any story with swords and sorcery, is that sword and sorcery? It would seem like no.
You would hope not.
You would hope not. You would really hope not. There's a lot of these stories, swords and
Yeah.
sorcery. But, like, you really have to wonder, what is sword and sorcery as cinema?
Yeah. Because obviously, to some extent, genre is what genre does. There's a certain culture level impact that the genre has that other genres probably don't have. And while we see in the 60s, that's in response to a lot of heavy issues. It's sort of an escapism for a lot of people.
Right.
In the 80s, as we're talking about, we move right into movies.
Yeah.
No more dusty old books. No more comic books. We're over it.
That shit's over.
Movies
Old and
now.
busted. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We have HD, not quite,
Well,
but we have cool effects. We have
As good
good
as.
actors most of the time and good stories some of the time.
yeah, well, yeah. That one you can take or leave.
Yeah. And obviously, Conan the Barbarian, 1982.
Right.
This movie, highly anticipated.
Beautiful.
The story still on everyone's minds.
Schwarzenegger.
Still Schwarzenegger on everyone's minds as well for a
Yeah.
lot of reasons.
For
Big
many
guy,
reasons.
sexy man. I'm
Big
thinking
arms.
about him.
Governor of
Constantly.
California.
Governor of California, political official.
My president. Really.
That's the real intersection between politics and the sword and sorcery genre.
Yeah, you wonder why is it important now? It's because, sometimes these actors, they will become political officials, We need to catalog these people now before they go on into the public sphere.
And sometimes they become the dad from Good Luck Charlie.
Good luck, Charlie.
We'll get into that when it's
uh-huh.
time, of course.
Mr. Kramer himself.
Everyone's favorite Seinfeld character, the dad from Good Luck Charlie, also known as Kramer. But the cinematic genre of sword and sorcery, I would say, is even less well-defined than the literary. Movies based on folklore, mythology, history, and fantasy can all exhibit some of the common tropes and themes associated with the sword and sorcery story. Obviously, fantasy writing has evolved since the 50s, into the 60s, 70s, all kinds of stories. Young adult fiction, very big. We were raised on that stuff.
Yeah, Percy Jackson, Harry
And in
Potter.
a way, swords, sorcery,
Yeah,
heroic fantasy-ish.
I would say so. Very much like Percy Jackson, when you read it, it's very marked by like these, feats of heroic, maybe not always strength, but like problem solving. Sometimes, he exhibits character traits. I think you could still read Percy Jackson or like any other young adult fantasy as following from the lineage of the heroic fantasy, the sword and sorcery genre.
Yeah. And when we're talking about movies as a visual medium, there are some tropes that are taken from the stories. Obviously, the hyper-violence, the lewdness, prominent in Conan-type stories.
Well, and you look at Star Wars alone.
Yeah.
Like the Star Wars movie poster, what is that if not a direct homage to the pulpy sword and sorcery movie, or like books and like comic strips of the past,
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, the hyperness
Mhm.
of the sword and sorcery genre
Yeah.
is especially attractive in the visual format as well. Because, as you've very aptly put it, you have a lot of like coked up 80s directors who are just ready to give you everything you want in a movie. Big guys, beautiful women,
Sure.
evil sorcerers, heads chopped off.
Mhm. Sometimes a
brothels.
magic item that does something.
Sometimes there's magic, and sometimes the magic is consequential. It's about 50-50.
It's really about 50-50. You'll see.
Yeah. But when we're talking about what makes a sword and sorcery story as a movie, how we categorize it, it's a very difficult question. Categories like the action movie,
Sure.
like the fantasy movie, the science fiction movie generally are pretty easy to identify.
Uh-huh.
If you have a guy doing action movie.
If Tom Cruise is running around on screen,
On little stilts.
Yeah. He's standing on a soapbox.
That's a real action movie.
Uh-huh.
And that's in many ways prototypical of what other action movies look like. I think Mission Impossible, great example of a movie that can easily identify a genre. The schema for an action movie, you've got fast cars, you got guys shooting guns. Sci-fi movie, you got to be in space.
Uh-huh.
There are
Alien
certain
babes.
checklist items.
Yeah.
Alien babes in space as well.
Sure.
That's what's so great about space.
Anything can
That's why
happen.
we're
up there.
trying to get there.
Yeah. We want to see the babe.
But, the babes checklist, the babe alien checklist isn't necessarily as clearly identifiable for sword and sorcery stories.
Sure.
There are a lot of other subgenres of storytelling and fantasy in general that can kind of get mixed and melded in, epic fantasy,
Right.
and even more generally, mythology. I think this is a really interesting point to talk about because take a movie, Jason and the Argonauts.
Yeah, right.
Or even folklore, Jack the Giant Killer. Are these sword and sorcery stories?
I like the idea of referring to Jack the Giant Killer as
That's
folklore.
right.
Yeah.
It comes from some culture, presumably.
Sure. Yeah.
Some folk tale.
It was Italian, right? It was
Could
as
be.
most of these movies
Uh-huh.
are. Yeah.
And you got to wonder what elements of a mythological narrative are excused from a sword and sorcery story. Is something so real? Oh, well, if they talk about ancient Greece and Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, or Troy, which we now know is real,
Sure.
does that make it not fantasy?
Right. And I think a good example of this dilemma is going back to Conan the Barbarian itself. Like in those stories, it's in the vein of a historical epic, but the names of the countries are switched around a little bit. Greece is Stygia. Like there's all of these like different analog names. And you'll see that with most sword and sorcery movies. The countries will be analogs for real world places because they want to capture the violence, the political shifts of history without making it too close to real world history. And like I think that mix of antiquity but still distancing from reality is something that marks sword and sorcery interestingly. But I guess the question is, how do we get to that point of the need for distancing from reality, from folklore, which is itself inherently based in reality, in history. It's folklore in a very real
it
sense.
is.
Yeah.
Well, and in some ways, as fantasy sort of abstracts itself from the nature of reality and stories build on each other, you almost have stories about stories.
Right.
You have folklore about folklore, which is very interesting, very meta. And I think one thing we're going to try to do is kind of push that envelope a little bit. Obviously, some movies, Conan the Barbarian, indisputably a sword and sorcery film.
Yeah.
Other films that have a national origin in local folklore or mythology that's known generally, even Greek mythology is in itself Western folklore of a kind.
Yeah.
So when we look at those kinds of movies, you know, maybe we'll throw one in every now and then, and we'll talk about how that can contribute to establishing or disestablishing the genre.
This guy just wants to watch Troy. He wants to watch
I just
Troy
want to watch
so bad.
Troy, guys. It's not
He
that
just wants to see Brad Pitt in some sandals.
it's not that big of a deal, okay? I want to see sweaty men fighting in the sand.
Right.
Amazing film.
I'll take your word for it. Never seen
Yeah.
it. Never seen it.
And that's why we're doing the podcast. To
Right.
make you watch
This
Troy.
is all a ploy.
The Troy ploy.
Uh-huh.
This is the Trojan horse.
Oh, that's
We're
good.
in it right now.
That's good.
These movies are fun.
They're
That's one of the biggest things I'll say about establishing a cinematic genre that is sword and sorcery. You got to have fun with it.
Yeah.
It's got to be camp in many cases. I think a lot of people, especially when you grow up watching some of these movies, older viewers alive in the 80s, probably saw some of these as they came out. And looking back on them now, incredibly camp.
Sure.
Camp to the point of being unacceptably camp in some cases. Things are a little over the top.
Right.
The sensibilities of a 21st century person can be challenged by things that happen in these movies.
Yeah.
I'll say that.
Yeah, there are definite points of, if we're getting back to the point that you've kind of been alluding to earlier of escapism, you know, you wonder escapism for who?
Yeah.
You know?
For me.
These movies were made for a very male, really white male audience.
Yeah.
And escapism for them may not look like escapism for everybody else, you know. And for that reason, some of these, you know, fantasies can seem uncomfortable for other viewers. But I think it's important to look at that, to analyze what is happening here, to see, I guess, how sensibilities have shifted, in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, it is absolutely a reflection of the cultural dogma of what's happening in society at the time and what's acceptable to show on screen.
Right.
That element is especially interesting in the 21st century, where we have shows coming out now, Euphoria, The Idol, HBO really leading the
Sam
charge
Levinson
on
is really
risque
good in that.
content. Thanks to the genius, the
Do
perverted
not let
genius of
him
Sam Levinson.
a sword and sorcery film. It would be terrible.
Please
it
no.
would ruin the
Please
world.
no. And I think one element of these newer shows and films that exhibit explicit content that might be missing in sword and sorcery films is the purpose, right?
Yeah.
What is this explicit nature of the film doing to either further the plot, further the themes? Is it doing anything at all?
Right. And, you know, when you read Conan, there's very much a sense of the explicit, the violent, all of these things feeding into a sense of human nature in a way.
Yeah.
Like the ultimate heights of human feeling, human emotion. But I think, what you're saying about the pointlessness of certain amounts of like nudity or exploitation in these 80s films is that it almost seems passionless at a certain point. Like it seems like these things are being thrown in to, I guess, mindlessly titillate in a sense, versus like actually stoke emotion to represent, passion. But you know, it's each their own, right?
Yeah, it's each their own. And I think what we don't have time to talk about, but is an interesting, broader question to talk about is, what is the purpose of a movie? What is a movie supposed to do?
Yeah.
Is it purely to entertain? Can movies just be entertainment? And I think while Sword and Sorcery in its infancy, when Robert E. Howard is writing Conan, certainly had a lot of very interesting hot takes, if you will, about the role of civilization in pacifying people and suppressing or even engendering violence. That's there. You can see that. You can read that in the story. Does some of that get lost as we go into the 80s?
Oh, most certainly. Yeah.
Most certainly.
Because at a certain point, as you're saying, the barbarian becomes a figure that is not used to lambast or criticize society. It's a figure of just a big guy wearing a loincloth, you know?
Yeah.
Instead of showing any kind of salient point about the world that we're living in, it becomes a showcase of just some man's muscles.
Yeah. Which is a difference in medium, I think, a lot of the times, because while you read a book, you can't imagine what the places look like, what the characters look like. But if somebody's literally showing it to you, well, they're going to show you the most visually stimulating, pleasing thing they can.
Sweaty, greasy, oiled up man.
Just covered in baby oil, head to toe.
Yeah.
Because that's what you wanted
exciting.
in the 80s.
You know, hey, it's what we want now, I think.
The powerlifter fantasy of being like Arnold.
Just some orange man. Just a large, hot dog looking man.
And there's an element of levity and fun to that as well. And I think when we talk about these movies, as we will in the weeks to come, and when we review these movies, we're still going to have fun with it.
Right.
There are going to be things in some movies, and when is appropriate, we will issue a content warning. If that's going to be in one of our upcoming movies, we'll let you know. Things you might want to fast forward through.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, I think it's important to remember these are just stories that are being told by people, and they are more a reflection of what's happening internally with the director, the creator, the actors, the writers, than a reflection of real events that actually happened. In many cases, racism was still alive in the 80s. I want to put that out there.
It was very much out and about.
It was.
It
But
still is now.
if you
Still
can
is
believe
now.
it.
Yeah.
We haven't beat it yet. We're
Uh-huh.
almost there. This podcast has got to be a step in the right direction.
Right. If we just get enough buff guys with
Mhm.
enough swords, maybe we'll take
we can
down-
liberate everyone.
We can liberate
in the
everybody.
world.
Yeah.
But we're not actually liberating or enslaving people within the scope of the movie itself
Sure.
as a work of fiction, as a piece of entertainment. So we're all going to try to have fun with it, and we hope you can have fun with it too.
Yeah.
I think that's an amazing place we can segue into the final question. What is sword and sorcery, not just as a genre
Yeah.
or genre of cinema, but as a podcast?
Oh. Now I'm interested. I was half asleep. I mean,
Uh-huh.
he saw me. My eyes, they were half lidded the whole
Yeah,
time.
I knew I had to bring the conversation back to Chase.
I needed it to be about me, and now we're here.
Now he's engaged. And I think doing something like this creative endeavor, obviously we find not just an element of entertainment in
Mhm.
what we can provide you, but some purpose as well. And I
Right.
think we wanted to, at this point, talk about why does this genre matter?
Yeah, and that's definitely an important question. People, they ask me on the street, Chase,
Yeah.
why are you
Please.
starting a podcast about
Tell
this?
me.
Aren't there enough men having podcasts talking about things into mics? And I said, well, they're not talking about this.
Oh, yeah.
They are not talking
You
about
won't find this anywhere else.
But I think, in a very broad sense, it's important to talk about the sword and sorcery genre, just for the simple reason that it is a precursor for so much of the fantasy, so much of the fiction that we enjoy now.
Of course.
And as Will was saying earlier, it does say something about the, at least, interior worlds of the people who were creating these stories. It says something about the biases, the hopes, the dreams, as all fiction does. And I think it's important to study fiction, especially fiction that I think, in my opinion, has been disregarded in the way that sword and sorcery fiction has. And even beyond all that, just because it's fun to talk about.
It is fun to talk about.
It's fun to be
Absolutely.
in a soundproof room with my buddy Will here,
Yeah, and of course, we're some fantasy experts.
Sure.
Chase, English major, specializes in fantasy.
Hey, I didn't want to brag, but
You know, me, a guy, specializes in fantasizing.
Oh yeah.
That's got to count for
Uh-huh.
something.
Every time I look at him, he's staring off wistfully. Yeah.
I'm always, I'm daydreaming some
Uh-huh.
wild gallivanting adventure with my three-pronged sword.
Oh yeah, that's good. Yeah, shoots other swords out
Mhm.
of it. Yeah.
That's the magic.
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
We'll get to that.
But the power of a story cannot be overlooked. It's been talked about on a million different podcasts and TED Talks and
Sure.
writers' workshops. But there is something, I think, very liberating, if not escaping, in the nature of engaging a story like this in your conscience, thinking about what it does for you in the moment and that experience of watching the movie, reading the book, but also what does it do for you as a human?
Right. Why do I feel these intense emotions towards this story? What within me is being
Exactly.
activated by this? Yeah, exactly.
And this genre, we both agree, coming into this podcast, is an important and evocative way of reaching that emotional height, possibly in the 21st century as well. The genre has died off. We ended our history kind of in the 80s because that's largely where things
The boom.
end.
Yeah.
The literary merit of the genre is somewhat stripped away
Yeah.
by the camp films of the 80s. And while you do have newer Conan the Barbarian movies
Yeah, Jason Momoa, he's out
going
there.
up into the
Yeah.
2000s, right? They're flops. They're flubs.
Sure.
They're not highly regarded
Yeah.
in any way. And I think going into this, we talked a lot about what can the genre do today? What can it do for people today? Readers of fantasy and just people.
Right. And I think the most important part of that is something that we touched on earlier in the podcast. This is a callback.
Oh, yeah.
The idea of sword and sorcery being a genre that, instead of, like, as opposed to epic fantasy, which focuses on these larger political shifts, these greater battles between armies, what have you, sword and sorcery, it's focused on the individual. It's focused on the interiority, the feelings of one person, one person's interactions with other people. And I think that in itself is something that's very important, because that's what we see in so much, as we mentioned earlier, young adult fiction. It is focused on the interiority of whatever one person, groups of people, in the same way that sword and sorcery was then. Sword and sorcery is the direct, I guess, precursor to these more interpersonal focused fantasy stories. And I think that is because it does have a power that other genres of fantasy may not have to evoke personal feelings of triumph, of loss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, especially in a time where things are rough, and things have been rough in most times
Sure.
of
I would-
human
I would
existence.
say.
But it's not like they necessarily are getting any easier.
Right.
The things that we have to overcome, high inflation,
Sure.
climate change, they're big problems. They're big problems that seem almost too encompassing and too large for an individual to do anything about.
Right.
So that catharsis that you're talking about of an individual reaching triumph by their own merit, by
Right.
the strength of their meaty arm, it's something that is still, it's an attractive narrative of victory
Mhm.
that people might not get in their ordinary lives.
Yeah.
That's just a worker.
And I think, in a broad archetypal sense, maybe the power of the barbarian as a character is that what makes Conan special is not necessarily something that is removed or something that's lacking from other people. It's something that all people share. It's human passion, it's human strength that unites all people, and that's what he's using in these stories. And I think that idea can be used as a source of unity for all people.
Yeah. Beautiful.
It's beautiful.
I couldn't have said it better myself, and
Yeah.
I won't even try.
He's a beautiful guy. That Conan.
And to get very, very meta at this point, we're going to talk about, well, what is this podcast? What's it going to look like week to week? What do we do here?
Well, it's a visual, it's an auditory medium. It doesn't look like anything.
Yeah,
I'll tell you that
that's
much.
true.
Yeah.
Well, and if you could see what we look like right now,
You'd
the
be
things we're
horrified.
doing in the studio,
Shit we're getting up to in here.
you would not believe.
Yeah.
Let me tell you that. But each week, and it will be each week,
Oh, yeah.
fingers crossed,
Fingers crossed.
we can do it. I
Yeah.
think we can do
I
it.
think so.
We're going to watch a movie, and this is going to be considered very, in a conceptual way, season 1
Right.
of the Sorta Sorcery podcast.
Right.
We love fantasy. We love all genres of fantasy.
Mhm.
They all have their merits. We're starting with this. We like this. We love these movies. They're funny. They're goofy. We're
Right.
going to have a lot of gaffes and laughs. And that's what we want you guys, the listeners, to be here for.
Mhm.
Enjoy those laughs with us. But eventually, we might transition to other things as well. For the time, for this season, we're going to watch movies, baby. We're going to
Oh, yeah.
we're going to open up Amazon Prime and find the lowest of the low.
They'll put anything on there.
You can upload whatever you want.
Yeah.
And that
Hey,
is the beauty.
You, the listener, could upload something right now. We'll have to.
Yeah, and we'll have to watch it. That's
Yeah,
just how the
legally,
show
we'll
works.
have to watch it.
But we're going to watch a movie.
Yep.
And we're going to tell you at the end of this episode and at the end of every other episode
Mhm.
what movie we're going to watch. You can watch along if you want.
Yeah.
If not, just come along for the ride.
We'll paint a picture in your mind.
Yeah, and in many ways that will be more hilarious and absurd
Yeah.
than actually watching the film, because you can't believe your ears
Uh-huh.
when you hear some of the things that happen in these movies.
Truly amazing.
We're going to do a plot synopsis. It's going to trade off. Each week, one of us is going to lead the charge on explaining whatever horrific and wondrous things happened in the film.
Right.
And
the other person will
person-
try to really just cut the other
Mhm.
person off at the pass as many times as possible.
Yeah, interject as many times as they can in
Make
that
it as hard
section
as
of the
possible
show.
for the person to speak.
But we're going to get both perspectives,
Mhm.
and we're going to get one person's perspective predominantly just to kind of see how we as individuals, what we think is important about the movie,
Right.
how we evaluate it
Right.
from a plot perspective, what's important about the plot, what is very, very dumb about the plot. That's the best part, in
Uh-huh.
my opinion. And we're going to review it. We're going to go over it. We're going to talk about things like the creation and the reception when that's applicable.
Mhm.
We'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the show when we announce what's going to be on the menu
Oh,
for
yeah.
next week.
Oh, yeah.
But we're going to go through some fun things. And I don't know if you want to talk about, since you are the architect in many ways, of the bingo card.
The bingo card.
What are some of the tropes, some of the things we might expect out of these movies and look for and hope for?
Well, just to name a few. So basically to, give you a look at what this bingo card is. It's a little checklist of things that really just appear throughout most of these films.
Mhm.
Most, if not all. Because it's really just tropes. And just a few of them to read off of here. The secret twist villain, that's a classic.
Classic.
Evil wizard, pretty closely related, but not always the same.
Yep.
The bland protagonist, well, what are you going to do about that?
It's tough.
Hard
Hard to write characters.
It's hard to write characters. Overly specific prophecy, barbarians, obviously, along with barbarians,
Mhm.
scantily clad people.
Yep.
Just these are things that you'll see in most sword and sorcery films, but they're just a little bit different each time.
A little bit different.
A little bit different, a little
yeah.
bit silly.
And we're gonna see. We're gonna see if we can get a bingo. My personal favorite, of course, are the RDGs.
Sure, he
The
loves
racially
RDGs.
dubious goblins.
Racially
You
dubious
would
goblins.
Be surprised
Yeah.
how many films have a racially dubious goblin or
And-
ghoul.
And little, listener, I'm seeing your face right now. You're wondering to yourself, racially dubious goblins. That they couldn't be in that many movies.
No.
There's simply no way.
There's no way.
that this term of racially dubious. These guys are just making this up.
Yeah.
Clearly,
They're just having a
someone
goof.
in the 80s would have had the sense to not include this trope in almost every Sword and Sorcery film.
Yeah.
A racially dubious goblin.
You're
Well,
gonna have to watch to
you'll
find out
see.
just how many films have RDGs in them.
You will see. And that segues perfectly into the movie
Oh yes.
we'll be discussing next week.
And it's going to be one of our personal favorites out
Yeah.
of the small library we have accumulated
Mhm.
watching Sword and Sorcery movies. It's a film by Ralph Bakshi,
Oh, yeah.
animator, pretty famous guy. He did Lord of the Rings,
Yes,
which,
he did.
if you know fantasy, you might know his Rotoscope adaptation. Guy loves Rotoscope.
Mhm.
We'll talk more about him on that episode and
More
all
on
the
him
funny
later.
things he did with Rotoscope. But this is a beautiful film.
Yeah.
A beautiful film.
Yeah.
And it's called Fire and Ice.
Fire and Ice.
Just rolls right off the tongue.
Yes, it does.
You can find it on YouTube.
Yeah.
Which is something I learned today.
Really?
You can also find it on Amazon Prime Video.
Yeah.
Of course.
if you want to support Jeff Bezos.
If you want to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's going to be a goof. It's going to be a gaff.
Yeah.
It's going to be a laugh. I love this movie.
It's a great movie.
I love things about this movie. I'll say that. I love things about this movie.
I will be as bold to say I love this movie.
Yeah.
I think, maybe what it represents, maybe not, whatever. But
It's really whatever.
it's really whatever. But, I had a great time watching it. There was one character specifically who I love.
Mhm.
Two characters, really.
Yeah.
And that's all you need in a movie.
That's all you need. Two guys to root
Just
for
two
or
guys.
against.
Yeah, right.
But we're going to talk about it next week. Fire and Ice. You find it anywhere you find
Fire and Ice.
videos on YouTube.
Pirate it. Watch it on YouTube.
Pirate it.
Whatever.
1, 2, 3 movie. I didn't say that.
We didn't say anything.
I don't know what that is.
I
I've never heard of
know what that is. I can't count. I don't know what movies
it. I
are.
don't have a computer. I don't go on the internet.
Officer, they're pulling me away. They're taking me away.
And that's all for today. Thank you all
Yeah.
for stopping in, for
Yeah.
listening. It was a blast.
I loved it.
Oh, yeah. And we will see you next week.
We will. I'll
Right
see
on
you.
time.
I'll be looking at you
Yep.
as you're listening to
Right
it.
through your screen.
Right through your AirPods. I'll be looking into your ear canal.
Man, you need to clean these out.
Damn, you live like
Shit.
this.
But it's going to be another hot, steaming episode
Oh yeah.
of Sorta Sorcery.
Sword of Sorcery.
And we'll see you there.
We'll see you there. Bye guys.